Hi, I'm Tim, welcome to our channel, and thanks for logging on today. A comparison that I've been awaiting for a long time. A showdown between white gold haute de gamme manual wind chronographs constructed in the traditional fashion within a few miles of each other within the city and canton of Genève. On the left, the Vacheron Constantin Patrimony Traditionnelle Chronograph 47192, and on the right, Patek Philippe 5170G-010. Two watches, both in white gold, from historic rivals, part of the trinity of Swiss high horology. Only Audemars is absent, and as Audemars does not feature a chronograph of matching description, it doesn't get to play in this sandbox. Now, the timepiece on my left is the 2013 boutique exclusive iteration of the Patrimony Traditionnelle Chronograph. Now, I'm going to zoom out a little bit, deactivate autofocus because it is the devil. I'm going to take you on a quick tour of this watch. The basic model launched at SIHH in 2009. So this iteration from 2013 represents one of the more imaginative variations on that basic watch. 42 millimeters across the round of the case, only 11 millimeters thick, 50 millimeters from lug to lug. It is considerably larger than the 5170. The boutique exclusive features embodied in the ruthenium coat of the dial and the contrast between the white gold and the rose gold components within and without. Now, both of these watches feature separate showcase videos, so I'm not going to get too deep into the fit and ergonomics of either, but I will give you a wrist impression. Sometimes it can be helpful to see these things in rapid succession. Now, this is my 16 centimeter circumference wrist, and the watch is 42 millimeters across, 11 millimeters thick, and 50 millimeters from lug to lug. It has a lot of presence, and it is impressively constructed. First of all, it is based on the older Lemania 2310 caliber, the column wheel version, effectively, of the caliber that went to the International Space Station and is still flight qualified by NASA. Actually, the most direct descendant of the original Moonwatch caliber, the one that flew with Neil Armstrong and co. Now, you might argue that this is the more obvious rival for a Lemania 2310 powered chronograph, but since the 5070 and the 47192 only overlap for 1 year in concurrent production, it's the 5170 that goes to bat against VC's finest. Now, you can see the case is handsomely laid out. I would argue that one of the advantages the Vacheron has over the Patek is the strength of the case styling. The coined case back, the stepped case flank, its strong horizontal character lines, and the step to the lugs, the underslung step to the lugs, which are fairly complex in their contouring and facets. This is a handsome watch. Its one quirk, again, something you'll see on the 5070 as well, is that the Lemania 2310 will effectively be undersized for a 42 millimeter watch, but that's part of the charm of the timepiece. Now, the dial is beautifully laid out. It features, in my opinion, a slightly more luxurious composition than the Patek 5170. The combination of metallic tones, silver and ruthenium, the rose gold, the handsome faceting of the dauphines at center, the blackened chronograph hands for seconds and minutes, as well as the countersunk registers for the constant seconds and chronograph minutes. In my opinion, and this is purely opinion, it's just a little bit more nuanced than the Patek, which drops the counters somewhat below the cannon pinion. You can see they're not all in line with each other, and relies on the emotional pull of the evocative medical pulsation scale and the applied white gold diamond polished Breguet numerals. But I just feel that the Vacheron says luxury, the Patek says classicism, and it's certainly that, but this gets the nod, at least from an aesthetic standpoint, and only from where I stand, of course. The tachometric scale being another element to contrast. Now, let me quickly, before I throw the Patek on the wrist, give you a quick sense of what these watches look like on the reverse side. The Patek caliber is larger, as you can see, although the case is smaller, the movement is broader across. Nevertheless, each one is equally attractive in its own way, but there are distinctions. Everything from the chronograph bridge to the composition of the fine adjustment mechanism on the balance cock. You can see right here it's a black polished swan's neck. Right here you can see it is a gyromax style freesprung system. You can see the difference in the column wheels, crenellated and polished with a screw cap. black polished and entirely capped in the Patek. You can also see the difference in the lateral drivetrain. You can see the two wheels of the system, the drivetrain being driven off the fourth wheel of the main drivetrain. But you can see on the Patek, it's entirely jeweled, driving wheel and intermediate wheel, an uncommon refinement on a lateral clutch chronograph. You'll also note the rack and snail minute jumper system used by the Patek versus the more conventional system, which is a semi-instantaneous jump used by the Vacheron. Note the difference in the chronograph bridge structures. I actually prefer the Vacheron on this count because the Vacheron features that tightly cleft and beautifully polished interior angle between the individual wheels of the chronograph system, and that's just a bit more difficult to finish than the continuously rounded anglage of the Patek bridges. I also think the unitary chronograph bridge is more aesthetically pleasing. That said, the execution of the Patek lateral clutch, and just for your reference, I'll show you the lateral clutch in action. You can see it moving in and out, into contact and out of contact with the wheel at center. I believe it's just a bit more exquisite with the Patek, fully jeweled, wispy, tapered, and bright polished on its edges, with a beautiful linear grain on its tops. It just strikes me as almost sensuous, sexy, sharp, and executed to the 10th. There's something about it that just goes the distance conceptually for me, whereas I feel Vacheron built a handsome lateral yoke, but it looks like a polished, grained, and anglage enhanced version of something you might see on an old Omega. It just doesn't go that extra distance in my book. That said, I feel the Vacheron has the more handsome case and the more nuanced and luxurious dial. Quick technical specifications: immense balance on the Vacheron. Smaller balance on the Patek. The Vacheron uses moment of inertia and a huge balance to achieve accuracy. The Patek uses its free-sprung architecture and a higher beat rate. 18,000 vibrations per hour, 28.8 right here. Now you'll also note that there's a very small hairline over the balance wheel, and that's because this is a Breguet overcoil with a hairspring guard, something that I've rarely seen on chronographs. This is something that was used in vintage chronographs to prevent an overcoil from getting tangled up upon itself during high impact. It's beautiful, it's refined, it's romantic, and it's almost invisible, but it's one reason why this watch, perhaps not the more elegant at first glance, really rewards closer viewing, whereas I feel like the Patek immediately speaks to the viewer and gives a great deal of pleasure without the need to get micro. You don't need 5, 10, 12 power loops to truly appreciate this watch. Now here's the other thing. 48-hour power reserve, 65-hour power reserve, non-hacking, absolutely hacks, and one of the few Patek Philippe calibers that does, for that matter. I would say the advantages of the Patek, and I'm going to throw it on my wrist now. This is a model that came out in 2010, oops, inverted there, and is still with us. But the advantages of the Patek are that it is more compact and perhaps more elegant. There are no tricks, there are no need for any kind of subterfuge to make the registers seem farther apart or fit them into the dial or the case. The movement was designed for the case, and it's beautiful for it. Now, you may ask, what is the real difference in size of the two calibers? Well, the Lemania-based 1141 in the Vacheron is, let me show you real quick. It's 27 millimeters across in a 42 millimeter case. The Patek is 29 millimeters across in a case that's 39.1 millimeters. So back to the wrist. What can I tell you about the Patek and the wrist fit of this watch? Well, I can tell you that it's an easier dress watch to wear on a smaller wrist. 39.1 millimeters across the round of the case, not including pushers or crowns. It's actually the same thickness as the Vacheron, but across the wrist more compact, 47.4 millimeters. I will say the Vacheron uses a combination of angles and curves in the composition of its case, whereas the Patek is more clearly devoted to the use of curves. Everything seems sensuous and fluid, and the only strong horizontal character lines are formed by the interplay of the case back, the case band, and the bezel. Now, the watch also features a simple dial that is, as I mentioned earlier, perhaps more romantic than the Vacheron. There's the appeal of that pulsation scale. There's the quirk of the calculated asymmetry of dropping the registers below the cannon pinion. And then there is always an allure on any Patek Philippe watch, complicated or simple, of the diamond polished white gold Breguet numerals. They simply sizzle. And I'll remind you, because we've got a 5070 handy, that this watch does not feature that same treatment. Handsome and imposing though it is, you can see some of the elements that distinguish the 5170 from its predecessor right here. You can see the use of multiple concentric tracks outboard of the registers, and you can also see how the registers are allowed to carve into the numerals. Well, no such malarkey here. Case, style, and movement designed to function together. Now, one important measure that does set it apart from the 5070 and the Vacheron is that it does feature hacking seconds, so you can precisely set against a reference time. Also important, and I think this is worth mentioning because it's part of the total experience, from a tactile standpoint, I think the Vacheron is more satisfying to wind. It has a rather pronounced set of detents and a click that you can hear and feel. It's almost like winding an old pocket watch. The Patek winds in more of a creamy fashion. It's highly refined, and undoubtedly this is by design, but the chronograph actuation, the interaction of the levers, the horns, and the column wheel is crisper, in my opinion, on the Patek Philippe. Also important to note, these watches do feature, in each instance, a deployant clasp in matching white gold. The Vacheron is a bit more Baroque. As you can see, it's a double fold mechanism. It's nicely curved to contour to the wrist. It features the Maltese cross on its exterior, so this is a handsome motif that repeats throughout Vacheron timepieces, and you can see it in the architecture of the buckle. It's just a bit more elaborate, in my opinion, taking the double fold and the buckle into account than the filigree style Calatrava cross on the single fold deployant of the Patek. It feels nicely finished, but it feels a little bit spare, and this is part of the total experience compared to the Vacheron, which I will deploy for your detailed viewing pleasure. Again, even the inside, polished and blasted with the Maltese cross logo inset and then again on the buckle. These watches are both special, and you don't pay this kind of money for a watch unless you're emotionally invested in it. And small touches like this help you to make that emotional leap more easily than, in my opinion, the ones and zeros flight by numbers Patek clasp. But they are both beautiful and both secure. Now, I'll also mention that it's important to note the refinements of the Patek are possibly more beautiful than those of the Vacheron, the fully jeweled and beautifully finished drivetrain of the chronograph. And again, we're going to show you that lateral clutch moving in and out. It's more beautiful than the Vacheron's. The black polished column wheel. No, you can't see the crenellated towers, but being fully capped, it also has the advantage of not just being beautiful on the top, but it prevents the horns and levers from jumping out under circumstances of extreme strain. Now again, the chronograph bridge, not as beautifully executed as the splayed single unit in the Vacheron, but it does feature that incredible jumper system. Let me see if I can show you that in action. I'll be mindful of where the seconds hand is. It's almost like watching a minute repeater operate in reverse. Now, what it lacks in bridges, it makes up in beautiful finishing, and every Côte de Genève stripe is beautifully aligned across these discontinuous components. Turning it back over, you can see as the seconds hand approaches 12 o'clock and prepares to roll over to the next minute, this is where the watch really comes into its own from a caseback standpoint. Now you can see as it approaches the end of its travel, you'll see the minute jumper mechanism engage and then jump. And it's truly special because this is something you won't see on any other chronograph that I know of in this segment. You can even see how the metal has been differentially finished to highlight the individual components. Beautifully executed and with a visible base plate that's more clearly evident than on the Vacheron. Let me show you that. You can barely see the base plate or its finish on the Vacheron, whereas on the Patek you can see a tight and even engine turning that I find highly attractive. Neither one of these watches will disappoint, but in my opinion, this is the intellectually appealing caliber. This one, a throwback to the middle of the last century, is perhaps the more emotionally appealing caliber. And of course, with hacking seconds and the longer power reserve, 65 here versus 48 with the Vacheron, the Patek certainly gets the edge in that respect. Okay, so we've discussed two of the premier chronographs of our era. We're going to bring them back into focus one last time. And because autofocus is the devil, I'm going to do this manually. even details down to the size of the registers, the orientation of the register with respect to the center of the dial, and the choice of baton hands versus dauphines sets these two watches apart. It would be absolutely appropriate to add both to your collection. But if you're going to add just one, for me, the Vacheron wins on pure emotional punch. There's a visceral quality to that dial with its multiple tones. It's honestly archaic and undersized twin register layout, and the combination of the dauphines with the baton indices beautifully splayed out to the periphery. Whereas the Patek, I think, is the watch that certainly makes its case as a combination of art and engineering. It's the more sophisticated watch, and if you have a smaller wrist, the more elegant and the more discreet. The Vacheron perhaps better suited to Miami Beach, the Patek perhaps better suited to New York or Chicago. My conclusion, although I would choose the Vacheron on the basis of character, the Patek probably takes the edge in movement refinement, and neither one of these watches represents a wrong answer. You can see them both on the watch box.